for extending the invitation to a designer. I feel completely out of place amongst you all social scientists, and I'm just a designer of cities, but I would want to actually start and share that with you and sort of my passion as an urbanist. But I invite you to my home, Cape Town, southern tip of Africa, and I remember as a young man, 8 years old, with my grandfather. We lived on the side of the hill there, it's Table Mountain. And for all of you who don't know, Cape Town is in one of the center of one of the most biodiverse areas on the planet. And my grandfather was a great walker. And we would walk every single week up that mountain. We would never take the cable car, we would walk it, and we would walk down. And it was most interesting because we walked the city. And for the last 50 years, I've been going back to the city and walking the city. And it's been very interesting for me because, one, I took away an amazing appreciation of the intersection and the overlap between city and nature. A very powerful landscape, and incredibly diverse. And when we would walk, we would talk about the plants, we would talk about the city. And there was this idea that we were in the same transect, and that's probably one of the most important things I'd like to actually suggest to all of you, that really urbanism and nature are in fact really importantly interwoven and overlap, and we need, in fact, in order to take on biodiversity, we need to talk about the design of cities. And so I've watched this part of the world really go to a crisis point in biodiversity while they have designed and continued to develop a really bad city, a really awful city. So in fact, in some ways, it is a lesson to me over 50 years of knowing this place and walking this place, that in fact city design is absolutely instrumental in being able to save biodiversity. And that's really probably my only point here to you all today. Just got to get this going here. The second point is, as a designer, all of you don't appreciate a designer until it fails. And this is Sandy in New York. And suddenly, design is instrumental in the city when it fails. But we don't really have a science of the city. And one of the most important things, again, I would actually suggest to all of you is get involved in the city. We desperately need the science and the art of city to begin to join. So as I look at city and I look towards the future, and this is a very big picture, there are three human agency trends: planetary urbanism, resource scarcity, and climate change, that for me lays a new groundwork for cities. These three have never confluenced in the history of mankind to come, and it's really a new field in terms of urbanism. It's an urban world as of 2007. We can debate time, but what I'm suggesting in planetary urbanism, it's not just the sheer numbers, it's not just the sheer location, is in fact that virtually everyone in every landscape today will be touched by some component of the city. The metabolism aspect of city touches the entire world. We are an urban species. We will, over the next 80 years or 100 years, we'll be evolving relationships, new institutions to be able to deal with the scale of cities that we have. We're going to do it for the very first time in a resource scarce era. Up to now, all city planning has never taken the basics of resources into account. We have had a resource abundance approach to cities. And just to be clear, if one looks over the next 35 years, we will be needing to build 60,000 homes or residents a day. We just do not have the material resources being able to be extracted, even if we had them in totality, to be able to do it at the type of formal design of essentially autocentric design. The other component, and this has all really happened sort of in the scale of things in 10 years, is cities are really instrumental in this issue of climate change. And I will argue that they fundamentally, the design of cities are contributing to it in a tremendous way. So I can't think of anything more important than this. We're at a change of an era from a city design perspective. Every second, 2 people join a city. That's 83 million people a year. That's 1.5 million a week. So in 2 weeks, we are designing a city like where I come from, St. Louis. We would have to design and build it every 2 weeks for the next 35 years to accommodate there. The scale of this is enormous. It's not going to happen in terms of a formal construction. So 6.8 billion people by 2050, that represents 70% of people who are living in cities, 9 billion by 2100. It's going to be distributed between some large cities and medium-sized below 2 million. But by 2100, and again, I'll just tell you, that's my grandfather's age, right? In one lifetime, we are talking about this transformation. In the time of a city, it's a very short time. Yet cities are really quite incredible armatures, right? 80% of all future growth, they're a concentration of innovation, social capital, talent, ambition, and vision. They're really amazingly incredible at generating innovation. However, they also, in terms of cities, we increasingly becoming, in some ways, inequitable between cities. So 10 megacities are generating 1/5 of the world's GDP. And you can look at some of the statistics. Tokyo, 28% of the population, 40% of the GDP. So cities, again, generate a lot of economic activity, but they also have a far greater ecological footprint than the smaller cities. So these mega cities that are concentrating wealth, concentrating innovation, are also one of the major culprits in the destruction of biodiversity and natural resources. I point one other thing to you. Lagos, that is currently 8% of Nigeria's population and 30% of the GDP, by 2100 will have 90 million people in it as projected. We have never designed a city of this size. It's twice the size of the largest city today, which is Tokyo at 35 million. How do we even begin to comprehend how to design that as we move forward? And so again, when you look at the system of megacities, and megacities in some ways are more powerful today than nations. You can see they account for 1/5 of the world's population, tremendous amount of the technology and the wealth. So they're incredibly productive on one level and incredibly destructive on the other. This ties a little bit into the consumption pattern as we have tied the development of cities into increased middle income consumption patterns. And there, the diagram on the right-hand side there, you can see the rise of another 4.9 billion people in the global south of middle income. And remember, middle income really pushes your ecological footprint. And so all the projections you are hearing, and this is very important as we move forward, all the projections of increase in food production, energy, need for water, is based on the assumption that our growth model is trying to emulate Western cities. And this is highly problematic, and our entire city philosophy of design is trying to emulate that form of growth. I would argue that given the number of people moving to cities, this just will not be possible. And as you begin to look at there, these are the major cities, and really just looking at 2015 where they are. In 2030, watch how they move through Asia, and by 2100 in Africa as the largest city. So this trajectory of the global south of where we will be building cities is vitally important. And so that is the trajectory, as you can see. And you can see, as mentioned earlier today, Africa is the fastest urbanizing continent today. It's growing. It's going to have another 3.5 billion or so people in there. As with the armature of the resource availability, the governance, you know this, the ability to build cities is not going to be there as we move forward. Mapping those same cities over the biological hotspots, and you can see the tremendous stress just the scale of these cities will be bringing to the biological resources here. Mapping it over crop richness as an example in terms of food. All this is going to show that the city's metabolism, their footprint is going to become more extensive. We've talked about China buying land already in Africa. How's Africa going to deal with another 3.5 billion people as we move forward? And then finally, water as one of the most instrumental components of cities. You can see the mapping of the surface water. And I'll come back to one of the struggles of this as we move forward. We've also begun to map where the resource extraction is actually occurring to be able to provide the materials if you wanted to build these cities here. But I just point to the last two lines on that slide. 2 tons of resources per capita in many of the global south countries versus 30 in the global north. So although the growth is in the global south, it's the global north that is in fact contributing to the consumption patterns that we have today. So the challenge for cities in the global south is, can you build for people while retaining the 2 tons of resource per person and not move it up to 30? And what are the implications for that as you move forward? So we really do need to think through how we can decouple the notion of urbanization, economic growth, and resource use. And this is going to be an enormous challenge. I will argue one of the most important components here is the current form of the city. The current form globally is sprawl. We like to think of many of the high-rise cities we see, but they are very small portions of existing cities. So if you look at Los Angeles, it's 2,750 people per square kilometer. The UN says for a sustainable city, you have to be aiming at about 15,000 people, just to give you a sense of what sprawl really means for consumptions. So the call for the compact city is going to be absolutely instrumental. And when we talk about, I want to make a difference between building density and people density. Having spent 10 years in China watching Shanghai and researching Shanghai, all those buildings that you see in that imagery of Shanghai, in many cases are vacant, right? And so they could be, you can build building dense cities, high cities, but people density is extremely low. And then you can have a system like this, where it's very much a horizontal city, but in fact, that is more dense than the center of Shanghai. So there you can see the densities, for instance, of Mumbai at nearly 30,000 people per square meter, which is twice the UN's recommendation. But you can see just in the last figure between Dakar and the city of Portland, how the parallel exists between 15 million in the same area as the city of Portland that has 60,000. And we think in America, Portland's really sustainable. We go out there to study sustainability of Portland, but it's fundamentally misguided as we move through. So when you look at where growth is in fact occurring per hour, look at 15 people per hour are moving to Mumbai, 85 to Lagos, Kinshasa 63, and I think Berlin is -1. So you can, again, this parallels much of what you've heard in terms of population, but it makes it really precise in terms of where people are. So it's really essentially a highly unequal world that we are developing as we move through here. There currently 1 in 3 dwellers are in informal settlements, known as slums to most people. And we have continued to add them. And this is very important because we've added more people in slums whilst we've reduced poverty. So slums and poverty must be decoupled in our concept as we move forward. But 5 million are moving per month in the global south into a resource-starved area as you move through. And this just makes the point that between now and 2030, we'll be adding another 1 billion people to slums. And we call them slums, and again, I want us to not use that term. rather use informal cities or emergent cities because slums have a relationship to notions of ghetto, corruption, crime, etc. And yes, there's certain parts of that, but that happens in formal urbanism as well. So the idea that you can have essentially informal urbanism, self-built cities that are in fact important generators. You can see in many of the numerous studies at Dharavi in Mumbai and the economic output of that and the number of people who live there who are really professional, who choose to stay in the slums and not move out. And there are a number of millionaires actually in the slums. So we have to really begin to understand the future of the city is a combination of formal and informal urbanism. And there's going to be a hybrid. In some cities, we'll have up to 75% of informality in the city as integral to the city. And that does not necessarily mean it's poverty. Again, just to ensure that we separate those two. However, how we design it can be extremely divided, and this is how we conceive it, because we are carrying in this notion that is in all the major global organizations document that slums equal bad, instead of seeing that slums are in fact self-built homes and the beginnings of the city. And this idea of the differentiation becomes very important. So an area that I've been studying for the last 10 years is Tijuana and San Diego, the border between Mexico and America. Tijuana is on the right-hand side. You can see a completely different urban form to America and San Diego on the left-hand side. This, for me, has been very, very interesting as study because I've been looking at this, how people use space and resources in designing this. I came to this project, and the fence between the two countries continues down the beach and into the ocean, and families meet either side because you can't get through the border, and that's a family picnic on the beach. So there are social implications. And of course, there are jobs on that side. I'm standing in Tijuana, and we're looking across into America because that's the job source there. But what's interesting in Tijuana, all the Americans come down to Tijuana because there's the most incredible medical and health system, which is substantially cheaper. So in fact, we're having people who are in fact retiring to this part of the country, Southern California, in order to just go drive down and get the best medical care you can at a fifth of the price in America. So there's this incredible connection between the two. Drawn to this, and you can't see any difference here as you look at that. And there's the line abstractly placed, and this is the Tijuana River watershed. And I was drawn to this because we were trying to save the Tijuana River estuary, which is in America, but in order to save it, we have to in fact deal with the entirety of the Tijuana watershed and the river in Mexico. So it became an interesting study of how we worked with the community, in fact, to try and restore it. But just looking at some of the metrics that one looks, and coming back to this issue between formal and informal urbanism, if you look at San Diego, 99% of it's formally urbanized, 60% of land is informally. And there's 2.3 million people in San Diego, and there's 3.5 million people in Tijuana in a quarter of the land area in the same ecosystem. And so the efficiency of land developed, as you can see here, there's 9.2 square meters per capita of undeveloped land in San Diego. In other words, it's sprawl versus 1.8 in Tijuana. So it's the Tijuana is developed much more densely. And you can see the implications. 9 times more undeveloped land in San Diego. Tijuana has 4 times the density of people. You can see it in relationship to jobs on the one side and services in terms of education. Clearly, it's all about jobs in San Diego, hence why you want to live in Tijuana. What interesting thing is just look at the difference between water use. And this is nearly 6 times more resourceful in water use. And everyone has water in Tijuana. Not necessarily pipe water, but there's always sufficient water. And interestingly, they are both supplied by the same system of distribution. But San Diego, in the way it uses water, is 6 times that. So studying this intersection between formal and informal, for me, is very interesting relative to that resource use. We've also been, over the last 10 years, working, these diagrams are in fact recording how people have settled and how Tijuana has emerged into a fully fledged city. And this is how you would arrive. You would arrive because there's the factory right next door to you there, and you would be buying off the trucks that are bringing the byproducts of San Diego into Tijuana to build your first home. You would secure it there. These are all reused products. When you have a little bit more money, you would in fact buy all the second-hand tires that are coming from the entirety of California, and you'd use those to situate your house and form a new terrace. You'd reconstruct your house. Once you had your job, you would buy the concrete block, you would formalize that terrace, all the tires are behind that concrete block terrace, and you would start to build your home. And you would build it in such a way, now you ultimately own this place, but you're building it tier by tier, floor by floor, and as you build it, so you move up one floor and you rent the floor below. This is an incredible way of wealth creation, individually and separately, and the building of an intense, medium, compact city. Very different to how we would be providing residential homes in America for the poor people, right? This is self-build, that they build instrumentally wealth into it as you move forward. You build a community around you incrementally as you develop. You put the school down on the bottom left. We've been working with them on river restoration. And finally, you get the community together and you make sure the government comes in and paves the land, provides you services, and so on, and then and business starts to go. And so you've got an emergent city that has built wealth incrementally and individually in a very compact, resource-efficient way as we move forward. And there comes the businesses, landscape, churches, and everything gets slowly retrofitted as you move forward. However, that doesn't necessarily mean formal and informal, in fact, isn't subject to natural disasters and flooding, and clearly the informal is very vulnerable. And this will sort of lead me on to the second part of the talk, of looking at cities and climate. And just to be clear, 15 of the 20 largest cities are in coastal areas. And you can see the list of the cities here, but it's well over multi-million of urban people at risk. So our greatest assets in some ways of urbanism, we have placed at the greatest risk in terms of climate change. We also have been pumping water for so many years in order to service those, that most of the cities are sinking simultaneously as sea level is rising. And this becomes matched together with extreme weather. And for the last 10 years, I've been working post-Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans and the Mississippi Delta, and investigating this correlation between sea level rise, sinking land, urbanization, and how those are all coming together in the destruction of the natural systems. So just to give you an idea, New Orleans is at the bottom there, but we have mapped, if you look at the list on the right-hand side, the intersection of everything that comes through New Orleans. In fact, there's a national security report saying it's absolutely essential to keep the mouth of the Mississippi River free and flowing for river transportation in order to ensure the food supply to the entirety of the Midwest. So everything that comes through in looking at saving New Orleans and the River Delta is really to do with the entire mid part of the country, and that system is quite amazing. But you know, it was founded, as many major commercial centers are founded in the middle of a delta. well understood of the dilemma that you would, why would you found a city in one of the most volatile and flexible environments, ever-changing environments as you move through. And again, you can see that essentially we sort of built that city. We built it at a point up the river that was very close to the portage between the lake and the river itself, but we built it very far upstream. And we changed the entirety of that landscape. As you well know, that the river is not really a river anymore. It is really a canal operated by the federal government under really very, very strict rules. So we would actually have to change the rules if we ever wanted to save this. But the principle here is that the natural system of the river, in terms of flooding, had high banks on the river, and you had the cypress swamps, which are green in that diagram, and much lower. So the safest place for you to be was on the river's edge. The worst place you could possibly be is in the green area there where the cypress swamps are. And of course, we removed all the cypress swamps to build the city. And at the same time, we discovered petroleum, which you can see in the bottom right there, and you go through the delta, and all you will see. The most important thing you can see is a little images on there, is how every well and access to well has cut up the wetlands. So you talk about habitat fragmentation. This is to perfection by the oil industry. And as you well know, this is now back on the agenda of America to continue this carving up of it. However, when you actually see what's happening, we're losing 1 acre of wetlands every 24 to 33 minutes. So, in the time of this talk, we've lost another 2 acres. And if we continue to do this, we've lost the size of Delaware already. Everything in red is under enormous threat, if not gone at this stage. So Hurricane Katrina came through at this point, and interestingly, as you all know, it actually missed New Orleans, and the back of it caught New Orleans. Otherwise, it would have been more severe. But already the city was a declining city, and it had all the social issues of the city. And this is very important, because as we move forward in dealing with cities in times of climate change, we will need to be actually acknowledging that what we have built hasn't necessarily been really that great, and we need to be re-envisioning that. It has continuously flooded over all those periods of time, and just remember where you see that blue is because, in fact, you'll see it again. This is the impact of Hurricane Katrina there. There's the flooding of that. But most important, it is the same area where the poorest people live. So if you remember that diagram, if you're rich, you live on the banks of the river. If you're poor, you live in what was some cypress swamps that have now been cleared and now continuously flood even at a heavy rain. So the issue of social justice in the city is absolutely fundamental, and you can see where all the damage is. Look at the very interesting area along the river that had no damage at the time of flood. The bottom images are something I took in the lower 9th Ward when we arrived. Important in all of this is the diaspora in terms, and look at, so a hurricane hit Katrina, and look at the impact on America. Many and most of those people never came back to the city. So the city was forever changed as we move forward in this. Did an entire recovery plan, really a lot of public input, etc. I'm not going to go through this other than to say that, this was very much a community-based planning process, and it was about scenario planning. It wasn't about trying to have one vision. It was trying to give alternates as you could move forward. So you could just repair what you had, or you could actually re-envision the entirety of the city, which is ultimately where they're going because of the unknown and the lack of certainty as you move forward. One of the instrumental things that came out for us, and this is the area of the lower 9th Ward, is that we could never actually make the lower 9th Ward safe again unless we did the natural systems restoration around it. So it had to be a combination of built and natural systems, and we had to be able to cope with the water within the city versus the water outside of the city. And if you look at the right-hand diagram, that was called Mr. Go. It was a channel that came into a shipping channel, and that's exactly where the storm surge came up through in Katrina and rebounded and broke the levees in the lower Ninth Ward and in the city. It's now closed. So, there's some very simple things. But let me come back to the multi-scalar approach and some more recent work as we've continued to work in this entire area and really look at the issue of how can we actually begin to think of saving the Delta, or is there that possibility? And I had to put this slide in because this is this was a team of scientists, geomorphologists, an enormous 30 people team that I led that did this work, and there have been multiple deltas over time. And this is really probably one of the most significant insights in looking at the evolution of this landscape as it has occurred over time. And we're at the Belize Bird's Foot is what it's called, delta, but you can see it's a delta that is actually extended further than any other delta in historic time, which is quite interesting. And as we've mapped all the current infrastructure, we've already understood that over the last 10 years, people voluntarily have been moving away. In fact, their houses are disappearing. Their backyards are disappearing. So we're already at a point of climate refugees down in the Mississippi Delta. And importantly, the people who are left behind are those who are poor. And so all those who have the means have been able to move. Those who haven't stay here and are weathering it. And we have a tremendous history of indigenous people in the Delta and a way of life, and they are in really complex situations because their life is changing as they're watching it. But let's look forward, which was our challenge. Our challenge was to come up with a 100-year plan for this. So this is the area, and you can see New Orleans there. Look to the left-hand side. The bigger one is Baton Rouge, which is way inland, right? And you can see 2065 sea level rise, 1,500 years, look at sea level rise. We've lost all that delta. You want to add storm surge, and New Orleans is completely isolated, and you back up trying to protect Baton Rouge. And this is as business as usual as you move forward. The other thing that we talked about is a subsidence. The entire Belize Delta foot is subsiding. It won't be there within 100 years or more as we move forward. We had a great group of scientists who actually did a sediment budget. They worked out how much dirt was coming down the Mississippi River and how we could begin to work through that and actually allow that to go back into the wetlands. The wetlands are dying because they have been disconnected from the sediment as they move forward. So much smaller delta, and so we've developed this plan of smaller, resilient, and regenerative, and can we actually regenerate this biological resource as we move through? And I'm just going to, in the last few minutes, talk about some of the ways we have thought about this. Fundamentally, we have to reconnect the river to the wetlands. That's their source. The sediment is critical in this. And we mapped all the historic connections. We mapped the traces in there and proposed a series of reconnections. Please understand we need federal jurisdiction to be able to do this. Because, of course, every connection takes down the water level that deals with navigation, etc. The other thing that we did, if you look between the two, there's the Belize Delta. At the moment, the Belize Delta is costing the federal government enormous amount of money because they have to dredge it every single day. And then they throw all the sediment, which would be really important for the wetlands, they throw it off the continental shelf. So we actually showed through economics that you could carve a new connection of the river in a place that was realistic from a morphological perspective of where the new bird's foot would be. And then we framed back where you could build safely. And this, again, is compact development. This area is the fastest growing area in Louisiana. And so then we wanted to, in fact, look at how all the delta living was happening. And we analyzed all the communities and really began to develop per community and type of lifestyle, how they could exist in this new landscape. And so it was very important, particularly for the indigenous people, that they could stay in this landscape. And so we had to work through a number of temporary development, revitalization, and development is that compact, well-protected, safe environment of where you put your funding resources as opposed to others. So we then built the light green is where all the ecologists felt through the reconnection to the river, you'd be able to rebuild the wetlands there and actually get some protection. And we built it solidly around the core of the city. Remembering as well, we had already done some work in ensuring that the center of the city, inside the levees, would in fact be able to survive. So we then had a series of barrier reefs, bay islands, reefs, and shoals, often artificially constructed, or we had used the natural flow of the ocean to create some of those, and use some of the sediment deposits that we could develop, and allow the bird's foot to evolve into a marsh environment. This was tied clearly to an estuarine gradient and successional ecology. This would be managed, it's adaptive over time. And we had to tie this to fisheries, because fishery leases there are really important, one of the most important things in that area. And then, of course, resolving the navigation. So we could put all of this together in a way that we felt that through a management and design, adaptive management, you would continuously monitor this and be able to reconstruct. So it was very possible, in fact, not to lose the delta, but you would have a very different delta. Most importantly, it was also about protecting the city, and it comes back to that very first point I wanted to make, which is city and nature and natural systems need to absolutely coexist and mutually reinforce themselves, and this is an idea for that. And so you can actually begin to have something that provides the jobs, really responds to different ways of living in there, whilst you can solidly build the ecological systems as you move forward. So I feel by redefining, looking at these three big trends and redefining the sort of idea that urbanism is an opportunity, but urbanism defined not just in terms of city, but defined as a system, a complex system that has to adapt over time, that is layered with the cities within it and is responsive to history and climate. And so there are three principles that we've been working with: connected and compact and humane. And not one of them alone is sufficient. All of them have to overlap and join. And that's in some ways the art of the design as we move forward. And so we believe that with this notion, the idea is that you can actually have a generative urbanism. Then you can actually improve the ecological functioning with an improvement city to a more humane and socially just city. And if done in an appropriate way, we're hoping that you'll be able to have sort of one planet living. But it's going to be very much about designing. There is at this point, there's insufficient knowledge. And this is sort of what are my observations and taking away. And I want to just reinforce the last one on the bottom there. There's an enormous need for interdisciplinary urbanism research, right? And what I mean by that is, all of you looking at biodiversity, from my perspective, cities are instrumental in that challenge. And not only do we want biodiversity within the city, we want to ensure the metabolism of the city, in fact, preserves the biodiversity sinks. And that notion, and some of you have indicated, and there's work to be done on how to do that. But this is an art and a science of urbanism that needs to be developed. And just again, I'll argue that we're only 10 years into essentially the sort of the age of the city as a new species. So we are an urban species. We are going to change. We have to really begin to understand wilderness to city as a transect. That very famous Geddes transect of there is really important to reform. Cities and will co-evolve with the ecological system. The current planning system is bankrupt. We need to fundamentally change it, and we need to move cities to be more resource efficient. And finally, the value of rethinking what is understood to be the slum and see it as an emergent form of urbanism that's part and integral to planetary urbanism is going to be vital. Thank you very much.
Thank you.